Dorothy Hale had been a wife for 39 years. Not a woman who happened to be married. A wife, in the full weight of that word, the kind that means you have organized your entire existence around another person's life and called it love. She had cooked and kept and managed and deferred and smiled at dinner parties and remembered every birthday of every person connected to Raymond Hale and never once asked what her own name meant apart from his. She was 63 years old on the morning it ended, standing in the kitchen of the house on Mercer Lane that she had repainted 3 times to suit Raymond's taste, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't managed to drink, while Raymond sat across from her at the table and said the words she had been half expecting for 2 years without ever letting herself fully believe. He wanted a divorce. He was calm about it. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the anger or the cruelty, which she could have fought back against. Just the calm. The paperwork already drafted. The name of his attorney. A timeline he had apparently been thinking about for months, while Dorothy had been thinking about whether to replant the garden beds along the south fence. She set down her coffee cup. She did not cry. Not then, not in front of him, because she was 63 years old and she had learned long ago that some things deserve to be cried over in private, in the dark, where no one could see what the grief actually cost you. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Dorothy Hale had grown up in a town called Sutter Falls in central Ohio, the kind of place that existed on maps because the railroad had once needed it to and had never quite caught up to the fact that the railroad was gone. Her mother, Vera, had lived there her entire life. Her father had left when Dorothy was 9, not dramatically, not with a scene or a suitcase thrown down the stairs. Just one morning, he had gone to work and come home less and less until he stopped coming home at all. Vera had never spoken of it with bitterness. She spoke of it the way she spoke of weather, as a thing that happened and was now finished. Vera was a small woman with large hands and an economy of movement that Dorothy had always associated with people who had learned that wasted effort was a form of waste they couldn't afford. She worked at the county records office for 31 years. She kept a clean house and a large garden, and she raised Dorothy without asking for help from anyone, which was both her greatest strength and the thing that had cost her most. Dorothy had left Sutter Falls at 22 for Columbus, where she worked as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized manufacturing firm with ambitions she had not yet named. She had been good with numbers in the specific way that some people are, not flashy, not theoretical, but practical and thorough. She caught errors. She saw patterns. She had the kind of mind that noticed when something didn't balance before she had consciously identified what the imbalance was. She met Raymond Hale at a company event in 1984. He was 32, dark-haired, confident in the particular way of a man who had never been told no by anything important. He sold commercial real estate and wore his suits well and had a laugh that filled a room without effort. Dorothy was 24. She had not expected him to notice her, and the noticing had felt like being chosen, which was a feeling she had been waiting for without realizing it. They were married inside a year. The early years were not unhappy. That was the complicated truth of it, the part that made the ending harder to process. Raymond was not a cruel man. He was a man of large appetites and small attentions, generous with money when the money was good, distracted when it wasn't, reliably present at the events that mattered to him and reliably absent at the ones that mattered to Dorothy. She had learned to manage around his edges, to fill in the spaces he left, to become, gradually and without any formal agreement, the person who held everything together so that Raymond could move through his life unbothered by its logistics. She had planned to restart her bookkeeping work after their first year of marriage. Then after the second year, when Raymond's business expanded and he needed someone to manage his office accounts. Then after their daughter Clara was born, because a small child needed consistency and Dorothy was the consistent one. Then after Clara started school. Then after Raymond's firm went through a restructure and the stress at home was too high for her to manage a relaunch on top of everything else. Then they stopped having the conversation entirely. What she did instead, she did well. She ran a large household. She kept Raymond's personal finances organized with the same precision she had once applied to corporate accounts. She oversaw 3 significant renovations of the Mercer Lane property over the years, managing contractors and budgets and timelines with the kind of competence that men in hard hats eventually respected once they stopped being surprised by it. She was active in Clara's school life, in their neighborhood association, in the quiet social infrastructure that made people feel welcome and cared for without anyone ever quite naming who was doing the caring. She poured everything she had into a life that turned out to belong primarily to Raymond. Clara was grown now, 34, living in Portland with a partner Dorothy liked, and a career in landscape architecture that suited her. She called her mother every Sunday morning without fail, which was the kind of loyalty that arrives in small, reliable habits and means more than any single gesture. Clara had known something was wrong long before Dorothy had admitted it, had said so once carefully, choosing her words the way she always had, and Dorothy had said things were fine and Clara had not pushed, because she had learned young that her mother's fine often meant something that would eventually need to be addressed, and there was no shortcutting the timeline on it. Raymond had been careful in the divorce. That was the correct word. Careful. He had documents Dorothy hadn't known existed. An attorney he had been meeting with, according to the filing dates, for nearly 4 months before the conversation at the kitchen table. The house on Mercer Lane had been purchased primarily with Raymond's income over the years, the mortgage in his name from the refinancing they had done in 2009. His attorney was precise about this. The accounts were divided according to what each had nominally contributed. The years of unpaid management, the office work, the renovation oversight, the social architecture of his professional life, none of that appeared on any balance sheet. Geraldine Moss, Dorothy's attorney, was competent and clear-eyed. She said she would get what she could. She got more than the opening offer, and less than was fair. Dorothy moved out of the house on Mercer Lane in August. She rented an apartment in a mid-rise in Columbus with a parking garage and a gym she never used and neighbors she never met. She was 63 years old with a settlement that would last a careful few years, a daughter in Portland, and a sense of herself that had been so thoroughly organized around another person's life that she wasn't entirely sure what remained when you took him out of it. She went through the motions of adjustment. She unpacked her boxes. She bought a coffee maker and a small bookshelf and a set of plates in a color she had chosen herself without consulting anyone. She called Clara every Sunday and said things were coming along, and Clara said of course they are, and both of them knew the conversation had a layer underneath it they would get to eventually. It was 3 months after the move that Dorothy drove back to Sutter Falls. She hadn't planned to. She had been meaning to go through her mother's things since Vera had died in January, 18 months before the divorce, which meant Dorothy had spent 18 months carrying that weight in addition to everything else without ever quite having the stillness to attend to it properly. The house on Birch Street where Dorothy had grown up had been sitting empty since the funeral. The neighbor who held a spare key had been checking on it once a week. The utilities were on a minimal plan. The property taxes had been paid from the estate account Dorothy had set up with her attorney. She drove there on a Tuesday in November, telling herself she was going to begin sorting through Vera's possessions, which was true, and that it would take 2 days, which turned out not to be. The house was smaller than she remembered in the way childhood homes always are. A white clapboard 2-story with a covered porch and a garden that had gone wild without Vera to tend it. The rose bushes along the front walk were overgrown, but still producing late-season hips. The vegetable beds along the back fence had given themselves over to weeds. The lilac by the side gate had spread considerably and was pressing against the fence with a confidence that suggested it had been planning this expansion for years. Dorothy let herself in with the spare key and stood in the front hallway for a moment, absorbing the smell. Old house, old wood, the particular faint scent of her mother's hand lotion that somehow had not entirely dissipated in the months since. The house was cold and quiet. The light through the curtained windows was gray and flat. She started in the kitchen, the practical center of Vera's life, and worked outward from there. 2 days of sorting. What went to the church donation, what went in boxes for Clara to decide about later, what had to be disposed of. Vera had not been a sentimental collector. She kept what was useful and let go of what wasn't with the same lack of drama she had applied to most things. The kitchen went quickly. The living room took longer only because of the photographs. The bedroom went one afternoon. The small guest room the following morning. The attic Dorothy had been avoiding. Not consciously. She had not made a decision to avoid it. She had simply found other things to do first. More rooms, more sorting, a second pass through the kitchen cabinets, a careful inventory of the items in Vera's small writing desk that yielded her parents' marriage certificate and a collection of Christmas cards going back 20 years, and a paperclip holding together two receipts from a hardware store that made no sense without context. On the fourth day, with everything else addressed, she climbed the attic stairs. The attic of the Birch Street house was the full footprint of the floor below, which made it larger than most. Vera had used it as genuine storage, not the catch-all chaos of an attic, but organized in her characteristic way. Labeled boxes on shelving units, clear pathways between them, winter items separated from seasonal items, separated from what Dorothy could only describe as historical items, which meant anything Vera had kept for reasons of memory rather than use. It smelled of cedar and dust, and something faintly metallic. Dorothy moved through it methodically, the way her mother had moved through everything. Box by box, making decisions. In the back left corner, behind a set of shelves holding Christmas decorations and tax records dating back to the 1980s, she found something she had not expected. A door. Not a dramatic door. Not a hidden room or a false wall. Just a plain wooden door, painted the same flat white as the attic walls, that she had never in 40 years of using this attic registered as anything other than part of the wall. She had walked past it 100 times as a child without once asking what was behind it. She stood in front of it for a long moment. The handle was a simple glass knob, the old-fashioned kind. She turned it. The door was locked. Dorothy stood there in the cold attic and looked at the locked door and thought about her mother. Vera had never mentioned this door, had never, in Dorothy's memory, referred to it, explained it, opened it in front of her, which meant she had either not thought it worth mentioning or had specifically chosen not to. And Dorothy had known her mother well enough to understand that those were not equivalent possibilities. She spent the rest of that afternoon looking for a key. She found it on the 5th day. She had gone back through the writing desk more carefully, this time removing the false bottom of the lower drawer that she had not previously noticed, because apparently she had been raised by a woman who kept things she did not intend to be found casually. Beneath the false bottom was a small envelope with Dorothy's name on it in Vera's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a brass key and a folded piece of paper. The paper held 4 lines in her mother's precise small print. Dorothy, the door at the back of the attic. Go through it. Read what you find before you call anyone. I should have told you sooner. I am sorry I waited. All my love, Mom. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She climbed the attic stairs again. She went to the back left corner. She put the key in the lock and turned it, and the door opened inward on hinges that were stiff but not rusted, because Vera, it turned out, had been oiling them. The space behind the door was a room. Not large, perhaps 12 feet by 10, but a real room, with a window on the outer wall that had been painted over on the outside to look like part of the siding and was therefore invisible from the street. The window let in gray November light through the paint, enough to see by. A dehumidifier, plugged into an outlet that had apparently been run to this space at some point, sat in the corner and hummed quietly, which explained why the room was dry when the rest of the attic smelled of old wood. There was a small table. On the table were 3 things. A metal box with a latch, the kind sold for document storage. A leather-bound ledger, old, its cover dark with handling. A framed photograph facing the wall. Dorothy stood in the doorway for a full minute before she walked in. She picked up the photograph first. She turned it over. The photograph was black and white and older than Dorothy herself. A woman she did not immediately recognize, standing in front of a building Dorothy had also never seen. The woman was young in the photograph, perhaps 30, dressed in the work clothes of someone who used them rather than posed in them. She was not looking at the camera, but slightly past it, towards something just out of frame. There was a handwritten note on the back in an unfamiliar hand. Millrace, 1961. The property is hers. Dorothy set the photograph down. She opened the metal box. Inside the box was a letter from her mother. 8 pages, handwritten, dated 3 months before Vera died. Beneath the letter was a folder of documents. Beneath the folder was a second envelope, sealed, with the name of a law office in the county seat written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Dorothy sat on the floor of the small hidden room and read her mother's letter. It took her a long time because she read slowly and because she stopped several times to absorb what she was reading. Vera had not always lived in Sutter Falls. This was the first thing Dorothy had not known. She had assumed her mother's entire life was the house on Birch Street, the county records job, the garden, the steady, unremarkable years of a small-town woman. It had seemed complete in itself. She had not thought to ask about before. The before was this. Vera had been born in Clarion County, in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, to parents who owned a working mill. Not a romantic mill, not a scenic postcard mill, but a functional industrial grinding mill built in the 1880s that had processed grain and feed for the surrounding farming community for 3 generations. Her family name was Crane, and the mill was the Crane Mill, and it sat on 7 acres along a creek called the Mill Race at the edge of a town so small it was now officially unincorporated. Vera had grown up working in the mill, not as a child laborer in the grim historical sense, but in the way that children of working properties grow up, as participants in a family enterprise that was the center of everything. She knew the machinery the way she later knew her own kitchen. She knew the accounts. She knew the names of every farmer who brought grain and the grades of what they brought and the prices the market supported in any given season. Her parents had died within 2 years of each other when Vera was 26. Her father first, then her mother, and the mill had passed to Vera as the only child. Vera had tried to run it. This was 1959. A 26-year-old woman trying to operate a working mill in rural Pennsylvania with no partner, no investor, and no one in the surrounding community who thought it was a reasonable undertaking. She had run it for 2 years. The letter described those 2 years in the brief, careful way Vera had described most difficult things, without self-pity, without lingering. She had run it, and she had kept it operating, and it had been hard in ways she did not go into detail about. In 1961, she met a man named Edward Holt at a farm equipment auction in the county seat. Holt was 35, charming in a way that read as substance before you understood it was technique. He was a land speculator, which in that part of Pennsylvania in 1961 meant a man who moved between properties looking for what he could extract at low cost and sell at a profit. He had heard about the mill. He expressed admiration for what Vera had done with it. He expressed more specific admiration for Vera. He proposed within 3 months. Vera said no to the proposal. She said yes to a business agreement, because she needed capital and Holt said he could bring it, and because she was 28 years old and exhausted and the loneliness of the mill was a weight she had underestimated. The business agreement was not what Holt had represented it to be. This was the part of the letter where Vera's handwriting changed slightly, became more careful, as though she had taken more time over each word. Holt had brought in a loan against the property without Vera's full understanding of the terms. The mill, the 7 acres, and the creek rights that came with them had been used as collateral for a note that Holt then defaulted on deliberately, having already arranged to purchase the debt from the bank at a fraction of its value through a third party. Vera had been, in the language that came later, defrauded. At the time she had understood only that the mill was gone and that the man she had trusted with it had known from the beginning how it would end. She had spent 2 years trying to recover the property through legal channels. The attorney she could afford in 1963 had done what he could and failed. The deed had transferred. The property was Holt's. She had left Clarion County and come to Ohio and taken a job at the county records office and built the quiet, contained life that Dorothy had grown up inside, and she had never spoken of any of it to anyone. But she had never stopped watching the property. This was the second thing Dorothy had not known. For 40 years, Vera had tracked the mill race property from a distance. Through the county assessor's records, which her job gave her access to in the abstract even when she had to write letters to Clarion County specifically. Through deed records. Through the kind of patient attention that becomes habit when the loss is large enough that you cannot let it settle. Edward Holt had died in 1978. The property had passed to his son, then to a development company, then through a period of tax delinquency, and then, in 2003, it had been purchased at a county tax sale for $11,000 by a man named Warren Tully, who lived in Pittsburgh and had apparently intended to do something with it, and never had. Vera had watched all of this. In 2011, Warren Tully had died without a will. The property had entered a probate situation that remained unresolved for 7 years because Tully had complicated family circumstances and no one with clear standing had pushed the matter to a conclusion. In 2018, the property had reverted to the county under Pennsylvania's unclaimed property provisions. Vera had been watching from Sutter Falls, Ohio, through letters and phone calls and the occasional drive she had made without telling Dorothy, who would have asked questions Vera was not ready to answer. In 2019, Vera had hired an attorney in Clarion County named James Okafor. She had worked with him for 2 years. She had not recovered the original property through the fraud claim, which was too old and too impractical, but she had done something different and more deliberate. The mill race property, 7 acres, and the mill structure, still standing, was now hers. James Okafor had established Vera's purchase of it from the county at the assessed value. The deed was clean. It had been held in a land trust under a name Dorothy did not recognize, which was how Vera had intended it. And the sealed envelope in the metal box, addressed to James Okafor's office, was the instruction that had been waiting for Dorothy to find it. For my daughter, tell her everything. Dorothy sat on the floor of the hidden room and held the documents and the letter and the photograph of her mother at 30 standing in front of a mill that she had lost and spent the rest of her life working quietly to recover. She looked at the framed photograph again. The property is hers. Vera had written her mother's note on the back, and then she had written a note of her own in the margin below it, in ink that was newer than the photograph. Now yours. Dorothy looked at that for a long time. Outside, the November wind moved through the overgrown garden and the rose bushes and the lilac that had been spreading for years without permission. Ordinary sounds. A town going about its Tuesday. She put everything back in the metal box. She took the sealed envelope addressed to James Okafor. She took the ledger. She closed the hidden room and locked it with the brass key and came back down through the attic and down the stairs and sat at her mother's kitchen table and made herself a cup of tea. She thought about 39 years of marriage ending at a kitchen table in Columbus. She thought about her mother at 28 years old, standing in the rubble of something she had built and trusted and lost to someone who had never intended anything but to take it. She thought about what it meant that Vera had spent 40 years watching and waiting and working quietly towards something she had not lived long enough to finish, but had left in a metal box under a locked door with a note that said, "Read everything before you call anyone." She read it again, all 8 pages, a second time more slowly than the first. Then she called Clara, not to tell her everything, not yet, just to hear her voice, to feel the reality of someone who was hers without condition. Clara answered on the second ring the way she always did. Said hello in the tone she used when she could tell from the single word of a greeting that something significant had happened. "Mom," she said. "What is it?" Not a question. Clara had learned that with Dorothy, most things that needed saying would come out if you gave them the space. "I found something in Grandma's attic," Dorothy said. "I need a few days to understand it before I can explain it. But I'm all right. I want you to know that first." "Okay," Clara said. "I think your grandmother left me something important." A pause. The kind that means the person on the other end is recalibrating. "How important?" Clara said. Dorothy looked at the metal box on the table in front of her. She thought about 7 acres along a creek in Clarion County. About a mill that had been standing since the 1880s. About a deed held in a land trust and a sealed envelope to an attorney and 40 years of patience that had outlasted the man who had stolen everything. "I don't know yet," Dorothy said. "I'm going to find out." She called James Okafor's office the following morning. She gave her name and explained who she was. The assistant did not seem surprised. She said Mr. Okafor had been expecting Dorothy's call for some time and that he had availability on Friday if she could make the drive to Clarion County. Dorothy said she could. She spent the 3 days before the drive going through the documents in the metal box with the methodical care she had applied to every set of accounts she had ever worked with. She did not rush. Rushing was how you miss things, and she had the feeling that nothing in this metal box should be missed. The ledger was the mill's original operating record, kept first by Vera's father and then by Vera herself through the 2 years she had managed the property. The entries ran from 1938 through 1961, 23 years of a business in its own handwriting. Grain received and grades assigned. Fees calculated against market prices that shifted season by season. Equipment expenses, repair records, the names of every farmer who had brought their harvest through the mill door. Names she did not recognize, but that felt specific, the kind of specificity that meant real people, real harvests, a real community built over generations around the fact that this mill was there to process what the land produced. Vera's father wrote in careful capital letters. Vera's own entries, beginning in 1959, were in a different hand, smaller, more compressed, the handwriting of a person who was thinking about more than she had room to write. Dorothy read every page. She read it slowly. The last entry in the ledger was dated August 1961. A routine transaction, grain received, fee recorded, customer name noted. Nothing in the entry signaled that it was the last. There was no final accounting, no closing note. It just stopped, the way things stop when they are taken from you before you have time to say goodbye to them. Dorothy sat at her mother's kitchen table with the ledger open to that last page for a long time. She thought about Vera writing that entry. 28 years old, not yet knowing what Edward Holt had set in motion. Going about the work of the mill on an ordinary August day, recording an ordinary transaction, with no indication yet that this was the end of something. She closed the ledger carefully and set it in the metal box. She drove to Clarion County 3 days later. She had spent the intervening time going through the documents in the metal box with the methodical care she had applied to every set of accounts in her life. The ledger was the mill's original operating record, kept by Vera's father and then by Vera herself through the 2 years she had run it. The entries went from 1938 through 1961, row by row, the kind of record-keeping that doesn't leave room for sentiment but holds the shape of a life in its columns. Grain received, fees charged, equipment expenses, names of customers going back 20 years. A business that had been real and functioning and then had disappeared from the record the way things disappear when someone takes them from you. The folder of documents held the chain of title going back to the original property. Every deed transfer from Vera's parents through to Holt, through to the development company, through to Tully, through to the county, and finally to the land trust. Vera had assembled this herself over 40 years of correspondence and county records requests, a task of such patient persistence that Dorothy had to stop and sit with what it must have cost her mother to keep doing it, year after year, watching ownership change hands on a property that should never have left her family. The deed in the trust was legitimate and current. Dorothy had called James Okafor's office the morning after finding the box, giving her name and explaining who she was. The assistant had said they had been expecting her call and that Mr. Okafor had time on Friday if she could make the drive. She made the drive. Clarion County was in the hill country, 200 miles from Columbus, the kind of landscape that looked like it was always in the process of becoming something, but had been making that transition for long enough that it was simply itself. Rolling hills, thin farms, towns that sat in the folds of valleys with the particular modesty of places that have never needed to announce themselves to anyone. James Okafor's office was in a converted Victorian on the main street of the county seat, a building that managed to look both old and cared for, which Dorothy had learned was not a common combination. He was a man in his early 50s with reading glasses he kept in his front pocket in a manner that was warm without being soft, the kind that comes from years of working with people in complicated situations and learning that most of them needed to be heard before they needed to be advised. He knew her mother well. That was the first thing, not in the way of a professional relationship. "Well, your mother drove out here 6 times over the 2 years we worked together," he said. "She always came alone. She was methodical and she had done significant research before she arrived. The deed history was almost entirely assembled by the time she contacted me. What she needed me for was the final step, the purchase from the county and the trust structure." He paused. She was the most prepared client I have ever worked with on a property matter. She knew every transfer. She had read the relevant case law. She had done everything except the final act. Dorothy thought about her mother at the county records office for 31 years, surrounded by documents, learning the language of property and ownership and transfer that she had been using all along to track what had been taken from her. She had not been filing papers for the county. She had been learning. The property, Okafor told her, was now Dorothy's without any conditions except those Vera had specified. The trust had transferred automatically on Vera's death, timed to coincide with the finding of the sealed envelope, which Vera had apparently been confident Dorothy would find eventually. She had left one instruction for Dorothy through the trust terms. "Do not sell the property for 1 year from the date of transfer. Go to it first." Dorothy looked at him. "Did she say why?" He smiled slightly. "She said you would understand when you saw it." She drove to the Millrace property the following morning. The road to it was a county lane that left the main road and wound through 3 miles of hill country before it reached a low wooden bridge over the creek that Vera had called the Millrace in her letter. Dorothy had looked up the creek. Its proper name was Millrace Run, a tributary of the Clarion River, and it ran clear and cold year-round, fast in spring, steady in summer, never fully frozen. The kind of creek that had powered things before electricity made that obsolete. She parked on the grass before the bridge and got out. The mill was visible from the road. She had expected something collapsed, something barely standing, the kind of ruin that a century of neglect produces in a wooden structure in Pennsylvania hill country. What she saw instead was not that. The Crane Mill was a stone building. 3 stories, the main structure, with a timber addition on the north end that had weathered but not failed. The stone walls were the local limestone, fitted close in the old way, and they had not moved in 140 years. The roof had lost sections and been patched in others, a patchwork of repairs and different decades of shingles. But it was a roof, and it was on the building. The millrace, the channel that had once directed water from the creek to power the wheel, was still visible, its stone walls intact, the wheel itself a different matter, rotted down to its axle hardware. The 7 acres around the building were field and creek bank and a stand of timber on the east side that had been growing since the mill stopped operating. Old growth by now, 60 years of undisturbed hardwood. Dorothy stood on the county lane and looked at what her mother had spent 40 years working to recover. She did not try to understand it all at once. She stood there for a long time and let it come to her in pieces, the way anything large comes to you when you have the patience to wait. She thought about Vera standing in this same place in the photograph, 30 years old, looking past the camera at something that was already hers to lose. She thought about the 2 years after the divorce, the apartment in Columbus, the gray flat feeling of a future that narrowed by the year. She thought about 39 years of organizing someone else's life, and the specific kind of exhaustion that was not physical, not the tired that came from work, but the tired that came from having pointed all of yourself at something that turned out to have been built for someone else. She thought about her mother doing the books at the county records office for 31 years and watching deed transfers and property records and learning everything there was to know about what could be lost and what could be found again and what it took to recover something you had once been told was gone forever. The Crane Mill stood in the November light at the end of a county lane in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, stone and timber, and 140 years of actual construction, and it was hers. Not nothing. Never nothing. She walked down to the low bridge and stood on it and listened to the creek run below, cold and clear and continuous, the sound of water that had been running here since before the mill was built and would be running long after every human decision connected to this land had been made and forgotten. She thought about the settlement. The number her attorney had called reasonable, more than Raymond had wanted to give and less than the years were worth. She thought about the apartment in Columbus with its parking garage, and its neighbors she never met, and its gym she never used, and the specific hollow quality of a life being assembled from scratch in a space that belonged to no one. She thought about what 39 years of careful, uncredited work had come to in a document written by an attorney who was being paid to protect someone other than her. She thought about Vera at 28, the county records job, 31 years of showing up, and all the while, the watching and the tracking and the patient accumulation of knowledge that nobody had known to call a plan, because it did not look like a plan from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a quiet woman working a quiet job in a quiet town. It looked like nothing was happening. It looked like a person who had accepted her circumstances and moved on. That was what made it so complete. Nobody had looked twice because nobody looks twice at a woman filing records. Nobody monitors the slow acquisition of legal knowledge in a county records office. Nobody watches a woman in Ohio writing letters to Pennsylvania every few years to track a property transaction. Nobody considers that the woman behind the desk might be building towards something on a timeline that has nothing to do with the fiscal year or the quarterly review or any timeline that produces results fast enough to be called ambitious. Vera had been the most ambitious person Dorothy had ever known. She understood that now, standing on a bridge over a creek in Clarion County, 40 years after the thing that had shaped her mother's entire working life had happened and been swallowed and turned into something that looked, from the outside, like surrender. It was not surrender. It was patience of a specific and extraordinary kind. Dorothy stayed on the bridge until the cold worked through her coat. Then she walked across it, up the bank, and to the mill door. James Okafor had sent her with 2 keys. She understood now that the second one, the newer key, fit the padlock on the mill door. Vera had left instructions with him about this too. Had thought ahead to the moment when Dorothy would stand at this door needing to open it, and made sure she could. She lifted the hasp, put the key in the padlock, and turned it. The lock opened cleanly. The door was heavy timber on iron hinges, the original hardware. She lifted the latch and pulled it open and stepped inside. The interior was dim and cold. The windows, high and small and thick with 60 years of dust, let in thin shafts of light that caught the particles in the air and held them visible. She stood inside the door and waited for her eyes to adjust and let the space come to her gradually. The mill was larger inside than its exterior had suggested, as stone buildings of this age often are. The walls ate 2 feet from every side, which meant the interior volume was generous, the ceilings high enough for the machinery to function without constraint. The ground floor was the main processing area, and it was intact. The millstones were there. Granite, the lower stone fixed in its housing, the upper stone still set above it, still connected to the drive shaft by hardware that had rusted at the surfaces but not failed at the core. The wooden components of the drive system, the shaft that would once have carried the turning force from the wheel to the stones, had darkened and dried over the decades but had not collapsed. The grain hoppers overhead were wooden bins built into the structure, the kind of joinery that understood its purpose and did not waste effort on what was not necessary. Several of them still held the hardened remnants of grain, dark and desiccated, a last harvest that had never been processed. She walked to the millstones. She put her hand on the upper stone, the runner stone, the one that moved. It was cold and slightly rough, granite that had ground grain for 70 years and remembered every harvest in the surface of it. She felt the weight of it through her palm, the density that time does not reduce, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the stone and let herself understand where she was. She was standing inside something her grandmother had built and her mother had lost and recovered and left for her. She was standing in the oldest thing she had ever owned. She looked around the mill, slowly, taking in each element in turn. The way she had learned to survey a renovation project, not looking for what was wrong first, but for what was present, for what was sound, for the bones of the thing before assessing the damage. The bones were good. The stone walls were solid. She knew enough about masonry to see that they had not shifted significantly. The foundation was dry, the hillside site and the stone construction working together the way the original builders had intended, water running away from the structure rather than toward it. The timber framing of the floors above was visible in places where boards had been removed or had fallen, and the main beams were substantial, old-growth timber of a size that was not available in modern construction, hardwood that had been slowly strengthening with age rather than weakening. The roof was the main problem, and she could see it clearly from the ground floor. A section over the north addition had given way at some point, probably within the last 20 years, and the ceiling boards below it showed the damage of water that had come in over time. The main structure over the processing area was intact, its roof pitched steep enough to shed water, its original slates still holding in most sections with newer patches in different materials marking where repairs had been made, probably by Warren Tully or someone before him, at intervals spread far enough apart that the patches did not match. It was not a quick restoration. She understood that immediately and without disappointment. Quick was not what this was for. She climbed the open stair to the second floor, testing each step before she put her weight on it, moving at the pace of someone who is paying attention rather than assuming. The second floor was storage, grain, and equipment, and it was emptier than the ground floor, the contents cleared at some point or simply decayed beyond recognition. The floor here was sound toward the center of the building, but compromised near the north wall, which was the wall adjacent to the failed section of roof. She did not go near that section. From the second floor window, she could see the mill race channel below, the stone-lined course that had diverted water from the creek to drive the wheel. It was silted in, 60 years of sediment filling the lower section, but the stone walls of the channel were intact, and she could trace the full length of it from the diversion point on the creek to the wheel housing at the mill wall. She stood at that window for a long time. The creek was visible from here, its surface gray in the November light, running steady and clear between its banks. The willows at the creek's edge had grown considerably over the years, and their bare November branches were reflected in the moving water below them. The timberland on the east side of the property began at the creek bank and ran uphill into the ridge, 60 years of undisturbed growth that was dense and dark even without leaves on the hardwoods. She thought about the timber appraised. The creek rights, which James Okafor had explained covered water use for operating purposes and had transferred with the property. The mill structure itself, stone and timber, on 7 acres of Pennsylvania hill country. She thought about what her mother had written in the letter. You have always been more capable than you have been asked to be. She had been asked to be capable in service of things that were not hers. She had been capable, thoroughly and without complaint, and the results had gone to Raymond's balance sheet and Raymond's property and Raymond's life, which had been constructed with her precision and her skill and had not, in the end, had room for her in it. She looked at the mill around her and felt the difference between that and this in a way that did not require analysis. This was hers, not because she had married it, not because she had been permitted to have it by someone else's generosity or oversight or the terms of a legal settlement, because her mother had spent 40 years working toward it and had left it to her specifically, knowing what she would need and when she would need it and trusting that she would find her way to it when the time came. She came down the stairs. She walked back through the ground floor and out through the heavy timber door and pulled it closed and latched it and stood on the bank above the mill race with the November light coming through the bare hardwoods on the ridge. She took out the notebook she had brought. She began to write down what she saw, not what was broken, what was there. The millstones, the drive shaft housing, the grain hoppers, the stone walls, each face, the floor by section, the ceiling timbers, the stair, the windows, the roof, section by section, the mill race channel, its condition, its full length, the wheel housing, what remained of it, the foundation perimeter, the north addition separately. She wrote for an hour. She wrote the way she had learned to write things down when they mattered, not quickly, not impressionistically, but with the specificity that lets you come back to a document 6 months later and know exactly what you were looking at. When she finished, she walked the perimeter of the property. 7 acres was not large. She covered it on foot in 40 minutes, walking the creek bank, the eastern timber edge, the lane that led to the road, the south side of the mill. She noted in the notebook what she could see from the ground. Timberland that had been growing undisturbed for 60 years. Creek access along the full west edge of the property. A flat section south of the mill that had once been a loading area, its original gravel still visible under the weeds, hard-packed enough that it had resisted erosion. She stood at the south loading area and looked back at the mill. From this angle, with the afternoon light coming from the west, the limestone walls took on a warmth that had not been visible in the flat gray of the morning. The stone was local. She could see that from the color and the texture, quarried from the same ridge the mill sat against, which was why it looked like it had grown from the hillside rather than been built on it. 140 years of weathering had darkened the mortar lines and rounded the corners of the stone slightly. Not worn down, settled into itself, the way old things settle when they have been standing long enough to stop arguing with their surroundings. She did not have a plan. She had a notebook with an hour of careful observation and a property she was not allowed to sell for a year. She had a mill and 7 acres and a creek and a stand of 60-year hardwood and 2 keys on a ring. She had her mother's letter in the metal box in the attic of the house on Birch Street. She had the ledger with its last entry in August 1961 and the 23 years of careful records that came before it. She had the specific capability that 39 years of uncredited work had produced in her without anyone noticing to call it experience. She had ground to stand on. Real ground. Her mother's ground, which was now hers. The plan would come. She was not in a hurry for it. Vera had not been in a hurry. James Okafor had said she came 4 times over 2 years, each time with something further understood, each visit building on the one before it. That was the pace of things built to last, not the pace of a real estate deal or a renovation budget or a quarterly report. The pace of a stone building that would still be standing when everyone connected to it today was gone. Dorothy walked back to her car. She put the notebook on the passenger seat. She drove back toward the county seat and found a diner on the main road that was open and sat at the counter and ate a bowl of soup she barely tasted and looked at the notes she had made. Then she called Clara. This time she told her everything. Clara listened the way she always had, without interruption, without trying to reframe it or fix it or lead it toward a resolution before it had found its own. She listened to all of it, the hidden room, the letter, the deed, the mill, The 40 years of Vera watching from Ohio and working quietly toward the thing she had lost. She listened to the description of the limestone walls and the millstones and the creek running clear and cold in the November light. When Dorothy stopped talking, there was a silence on the line. The good kind. The kind that means someone is actually holding what they have just been told. "Mom," Clara said finally. Dorothy waited. "She did it on purpose," Clara said. "Grandma did all of it on purpose." "Yes," Dorothy said. "She was waiting for the right moment to give it to you." "I think," Dorothy said, "that she was waiting for me to need it." Another silence. "Do you?" Clara said. "Need it?" Dorothy looked at the notebook on the seat beside her. She looked at the key on the ring in her coat pocket. She looked out through the diner window at the November hills of Clarion County, still and gray and holding their shapes patiently in the afternoon light. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." That was enough to begin. She drove back to Sutter Falls the following morning and spent 2 more days in her mother's house, finishing what she had started. The sorting she had come to do was done now. Technically, the rooms were clear, the boxes labeled, the decisions made. What remained was a different kind of work. She went back into the attic with a flashlight and a measuring tape and spent an hour in the hidden room going through the documents she had not yet examined with full attention. The folder beneath Vera's letter held materials she had moved past in the first reading, too concentrated on the letter itself to give the rest its due. She sat on the floor of the small dry room with the dehumidifier running its quiet cycle and went through every page. There was a survey, a professional land survey of the Mill Race property, commissioned in 2017, the year before Vera purchased it from the county. Vera had paid for this herself before she owned the property, which said something about the quality of her preparation and the certainty of her intentions. The survey established the property lines with precision, identified the creek boundary as a high water line setback, and noted the presence of the Mill Race Channel as a structural feature of the site. It also noted something Dorothy had not registered on her first visit: the water rights. The property held a senior water right on Mill Race Run, registered in 1882, predating most other appropriations on the creek. The right was attached to the land, not to any individual or business, which meant it had survived every transfer, every period of neglect, every change of ownership since the mill was built. The survey noted it as a feature with potential regulatory value, meaning it was the kind of right that other parties sometimes wished to acquire or had been known to argue over in water-scarce periods. Clarion County was not water-scarce, but a senior water right was a documented asset, and Vera had known it. Beneath the survey was a folder of correspondence. Letters Vera had exchanged over the years with the Clarion County Historical Society, with a railroad documentation nonprofit in Pittsburgh, and with 2 universities whose history departments had at various points expressed academic interest in rural Pennsylvania industrial sites. The letters were polite and patient on both sides. The Historical Society had visited the mill twice over the years, once in 1999 and once in 2012, when the property was still in private hands. Their visit reports, copies of which Vera had somehow obtained, described the structure as among the most intact surviving examples of 19th-century commercial milling in the western Pennsylvania hills. The phrase used in the 2012 report was architecturally significant. Dorothy read that phrase twice. She set the survey and the correspondence folder in her lap and sat with the dehumidifier and the yellow light and the November quiet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her mother had known. Not just that the property existed, not just that it was technically recoverable. She had known what it was. She had spent years quietly assembling documentation that described not a neglected ruin, but a historically significant structure with intact original machinery and a senior water right and decades of interest from the kinds of institutions that paid attention to such things. She had given Dorothy not just a piece of land. She had given her a case. The last item in the folder was a single sheet of paper in Vera's handwriting, undated, written in the margin note shorthand Vera used when she was thinking rather than drafting. A list of names with phone numbers and brief annotations. James Okafor, attorney, Clarion County. Handled the purchase. Knows everything. Trust him. Ruth Collard, historical preservation consultant, Pittsburgh. Visited site 2012. Interested. Thomas Weld, timber appraiser, Clarion County. Honest. Father used him for the Hennessy acreage. Paul Steger, mill restoration specialist, Lancaster County. Only one in the state who does this work properly. Stubborn but worth it. Grant Fenner, Clarion County Historical Society. Young, enthusiastic, thorough. We'll know who else to call. Dorothy looked at the list for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket alongside the keys. Her mother had done the introductions. She had assembled the people before Dorothy would know to look for them, had thought through who would be needed and when and why, had left their names in a list with annotations that amounted to instructions about how to begin each conversation. The way you leave a contact list for someone you trust with a task you cannot finish yourself. Dorothy had spent 39 years managing a household for a man who had not noticed what it cost her. She had tracked every contractor, vetted every vendor, managed every project with the same precision her mother had applied to the mill accounts. She had that competence completely. She had never applied it to anything of her own. She drove back to Columbus. She packed 2 boxes from the apartment. She called her landlord and gave notice. Then she drove to Sutter Falls for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, moved what she needed into the house on Birch Street, and began. James Okafor was the first call. He had been expecting it in the way that he had apparently been expecting everything connected to Dorothy, which meant Vera had briefed him thoroughly, and he was simply waiting for the timeline to advance. They met in his office on a Wednesday morning in late November, the same high-ceilinged Victorian with the wide plank floors, and the light that fell in generous bands through the tall windows. He had coffee waiting and a file on his desk that was thicker than the one she had seen on her first visit. "I've been holding some things until you'd had time to absorb the initial documents," he said. He opened the file. "Your mother continued corresponding with several parties after the purchase. There are letters here to the Historical Society, to a preservation nonprofit she found in 2020, and to a man named Paul Steger in Lancaster County. I found his name in her notes," Dorothy said. "He's the person she was most focused on at the end," Okafor said. "She wrote him twice. He responded once, briefly, to say he had visited the site in 2019 at his own initiative and found it worth discussing further. She was in the process of arranging a second meeting with him when she died." Dorothy looked at the letter Steger had written. 2 paragraphs, professional and spare, the tone of someone who chose his words with care because he understood their weight. He noted the condition of the millstones specifically, the French burr construction, which he said was unusual in Pennsylvania mills of that era, most of which had used local granite. He noted the drive shaft housing. He noted the mill race channel. He used the word exceptional once, in connection with the overall state of preservation relative to the age of the structure. He had not used that word lightly. She could tell from the way the rest of the letter was written that he was not a man who reached for adjectives. She called Paul Steger from the parking lot outside Okafor's office. He answered on the 4th ring with the abrupt manner of a man interrupted in physical work. She gave her name and said she was Vera Crane's daughter. There was a brief pause. "I was sorry to hear about your mother," he said, and the brevity of it was genuine rather than perfunctory. "She was a careful woman." "She was," Dorothy said. He asked when she could come to Lancaster County. She asked when he was available. He said Saturday, if she wanted to see the work he was currently finishing before they discussed anything else. She said Saturday was fine. The drive to Lancaster County was 2.5 hours southeast, through a landscape that shifted from the hills of Clarion County to the rolling farmland of the central part of the state. Paul Steger's operation was on a property outside a small town whose name she forgot immediately, a compound of working buildings centered on a large barn that had been converted into what could only be described as a mill hospital. The bones of 2 separate historic mill structures were in various stages of disassembly and reconstruction around the interior. Timbers labeled in chalk. Hardware organized in trays by type and date of manufacture. A smell of linseed oil and old wood, and the particular mineral scent of stone that had been worked. Steger was in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent decades doing work that required both force and precision and showed it. He shook her hand once and led her through the barn without preamble and let the work speak for 20 minutes before he said anything substantial about it. The mill he was reconstructing was a grist mill from Chester County, 1847, disassembled from a site that had been sold for development and transported to his facility for reconstruction at a museum in Delaware. He was 9 months into the project. She watched him describe the drive mechanism to her. The way the pit will engage the wallower, the way the wallower drove the main shaft, the way the main shaft carried the motion to the millstones, and she understood from the way he talked about it that this was not a man performing expertise for an audience. He simply knew the machinery the way some people know language. At the level of structure, below the vocabulary, he asked her to describe what she had seen at the crane mill. She described it from her notebook, which she had brought. He listened without interrupting. When she got to the millstones, he asked her what color they were. She said gray-white, with a surface texture she had described to herself as slightly waxy. He nodded. He asked about the dressing pattern, the grooves cut into the stone face. She had not known enough to look for that. She said so. He said he had seen them in 2019, and they were original. French burr, as he had written to her mother. Quarried in the La Ferté-Sous-Jouarre region of France and imported, which was unusual in rural Pennsylvania in the 1880s because it was expensive and meant that whoever built the crane mill had intended it to produce a finer grind than local granite could reliably achieve. He was quiet for a moment after she finished describing the rest. Then he said, "It is one of the 10 most intact 19th-century commercial mills I am aware of in Pennsylvania, possibly in the Northeast." He said it without theater, just as a statement of professional assessment. Dorothy kept her expression level. She asked him what that meant in practical terms. He picked up a piece of chalk and turned it over in his hand. "It means several things," he said. "For restoration purposes, what you have is a structure where the fundamental elements are present and original. The stones, the drive hardware, the channel, the main structural framing. The restoration cost is significant but bounded. You are not recreating missing elements from documentation and approximation. You are repairing and preserving what exists. That is a different category of project in terms of cost and outcome and integrity." He looked at her. "For institutional interest purposes," he said, "what you have is something that preservation societies and museums and grant programs have been trying to locate and secure for 30 years. Working examples of this type, with this level of original equipment, have become very rare. Most were demolished. Most of what survived lost its machinery when the machinery had value as scrap. The crane mill survived with its stones and its hardware because it was in a location remote enough that nobody found a compelling reason to strip it." He paused. "Your mother understood this," he said. "She asked the right questions in her letters. She understood that the value was not in the land or the building as a building. The value was in what was still inside it." Dorothy thought about Vera writing to Paul Steger from the house on Birch Street, thinking through the same questions Dorothy was asking now, arriving at the same understanding, and then dying before she could move past the understanding into the action. She had left the action for Dorothy. "What would it cost to restore it?" Dorothy asked. "To operational condition." He gave her a range. It was a serious number. Not a ruinous number, not beyond the reach of what the situation offered in combination with grant funding and institutional partnership, but a serious one that required planning and sequencing and a realistic timeline. He said 18 months minimum for the structural work and mechanical restoration. Longer if they were doing it properly, and he did not do it any other way. She asked him if he would take the project. He turned the chalk over in his hand again. "I've been waiting to be asked," he said. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She drove back through the Lancaster farmland and the central Pennsylvania hills with the heater running and her mind running faster than the road. She pulled over once, outside a small town whose gas station was the only light for a mile in either direction, and called Clara. "It's the real thing," she told her daughter. "The mill. It's historically significant. The restoration specialist says it's one of the 10 most intact examples in the state." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does that mean for you specifically?" "I don't know all of it yet," Dorothy said. "But it means it has options that go beyond what I understood when I first walked into it." Clara said, "Mom, you sound different." Dorothy sat in the parked car with the Pennsylvania dark around her and thought about that. "Different how?" she said. "Like yourself," Clara said. "Like the version of you that I always thought was in there." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll call you when I get back." She drove the rest of the way to Sutter Falls with the radio off and the notebook on the passenger seat, and the November dark outside, and the particular quality of movement that comes from going somewhere rather than away from something. The days that followed had a shape that was unfamiliar and then became familiar quickly, which told her something about what she had been missing in the apartment in Columbus without knowing it was missing. She woke early, before the light, made coffee in her mother's kitchen with her mother's coffee maker, and sat with her notebook and the list of names and worked through what needed to happen and in what order. Grant Finner at the Clarion County Historical Society was 29 years old, which Vera's annotation had not prepared her for, and had the specific energy of a person who had chosen a field that older colleagues occasionally described as obscure and had decided that obscure meant underserved rather than unimportant. He met her at the Crane Mill on a Thursday morning with his own camera and a folder of the Society's records going back to their first visit in 1999. He walked through the mill the way Paul Steger had talked about it, with an attention that was structural and unhurried. He took photographs of the millstones, the drive hardware, the mill race channel, the roof sections, the timber framing. He asked her permission before he photographed anything, which she noticed because it was the kind of consideration that reflects how someone actually thinks about ownership. Afterward, they stood on the loading area south of the mill, and he told her what the Historical Society could offer. They had a small grant fund for preliminary documentation of historic sites, he said. Not restoration money. Documentation. Professional survey, photographic archive, written structural assessment. The documentation was the first step toward eligibility for the larger preservation grants, the state and federal programs that funded actual restoration work. Without the documentation, the property couldn't apply. With it, and with Paul Steger's restoration plan, it would be a strong candidate. He said something else, which she had not expected. There is a preservation easement program, he said, run jointly through the State Historical Commission and a private foundation in Philadelphia. Properties that accept the easement in exchange for restoration funding agree to maintain the historic character of the site and allow limited public access. It doesn't transfer ownership. It funds the work and protects the property from incompatible development in perpetuity. He looked at the mill. A property like this would be a priority application, he said. The easement funding covers a significant portion of restoration costs. In combination with the mill being designated on the state register, which this property qualifies for, the public access requirement is usually no more than 12 to 15 days per year. Dorothy thought about what 12 to 15 days of public access per year looked like. She thought about what perpetual protection from incompatible development meant for a 7-acre property with a senior water right on a clear creek in the Pennsylvania Hill Country. She thought about Vera. Her mother had spent 40 years working toward this property. She had not done it so that Dorothy could sell it to a developer who would tear the mill down to build vacation cabins and charge access fees to the creek. She had done it because the mill was the Crane Mill, and the Crane Mill belonged to the Crane family. And what belonged to you did not stop belonging to you, because someone had taken it. You found your way back. You kept it. I want to understand the easement program fully, Dorothy said, before I commit to anything. But I want to understand it. Grant Finner nodded. He already had the application materials in his folder. He had brought them on the assumption that she might want them. That was the day Dorothy understood that her mother had not just left her a network of people who knew things. She had left her a network of people who were already leaning toward yes. Thomas Weld, the timber appraiser, came the following week. He was a man of 65 who arrived in a truck that had done more miles than it had any right to and walked the East Timber Stand with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been reading trees for 40 years and doesn't need instruments to form an opinion, though he used them anyway because an opinion you can document is worth more than one you can't. He spent 3 hours in the timberland. Dorothy walked with him for the first hour, and then sat on the creek bank while he continued, making notes and measurements in a logbook he kept in his breast pocket. When he came back out of the trees, he stood beside her on the bank and looked at his notes for a moment before speaking. The stand was primarily white oak and black cherry, he told her, with a significant presence of hard maple and some sugar maple toward the ridge. The oldest trees were consistent with 60 to 70 years of undisturbed growth, which matched the mill history. The stand had not been selectively harvested. It had been left entirely alone, which meant the timber density was high and the quality of the older trees was excellent. He gave her a value. Stumpage value, meaning the worth of the timber if harvested commercially. Then he gave her a second number, the appraised value of the standing timber as a conservation asset, the value recognized by conservation buyers and land trusts who were interested in protecting mature hardwood stands rather than cutting them. The second number was higher than the first. Dorothy looked at him. In the current market, he said carefully, mature hardwood stands of this composition on property with creek access and historic significance are more valuable intact than harvested. There are conservation buyers and land trusts specifically looking for this profile. She understood what he was telling her. The timber was not a liability, not a resource to be extracted. It was a feature. It added value to the property in a way that reinforced the easement approach rather than competing with it. She wrote the numbers in her notebook. Ruth Collard, the preservation consultant from Pittsburgh, drove out on a Saturday in December and spent 6 hours on the property. She was a woman of 58 with a direct manner and the habit of speaking in complete sentences that arrived at their point without detours. She had been inside the Crane Mill in 2012, and her memory of it was specific enough that she walked through the door and immediately noted 2 changes. The north roof section had lost more shingles since her last visit, and something had disturbed the grain hopper on the left side of the ground floor, probably an animal that had been using the building as winter shelter in the years of vacancy. She spent an hour with the millstones. She photographed the dressing pattern, which Dorothy had learned to look for since her conversation with Paul Steger. She photographed the runner stone mounting, the bridge tree, the governor housing. She spent 20 minutes with a small flashlight examining the pit under the wheel housing, the stone-lined foundation chamber where the water had once entered from the mill race. When she came out, she sat with Dorothy on the loading area and opened her laptop and showed her something Dorothy had not seen before. The National Register of Historic Places, she said. Industrial properties with operational machinery. The last Pennsylvania grist mill added to the register was in 1994. There are 11 currently listed. She scrolled to a map. Not one of them is within 60 miles of here. She looked at Dorothy. This property qualifies for listing, she said. The criteria are integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. The Crane Mill meets all 7. I have worked on 47 National Register applications in 20 years. This is the most straightforward case I have encountered. She paused. National Register listing does not restrict what you can do with a private property, but it unlocks federal preservation tax credits and makes the property eligible for the most substantial grant programs. In combination with the state easement grant Fenner mentioned, the funding picture becomes quite different. Dorothy asked her to be specific about quite different. Ruth Collard was the kind of person who preferred specifics to generalizations. She opened a spreadsheet and walked Dorothy through it column by column. The restoration cost Paul Steger had estimated. Against it, the federal historic tax credit at 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenses. The state historic preservation grant, a program that Dorothy had not previously known existed, that funded up to 40% of documented restoration costs for National Register properties. The preservation easement funding from the private foundation, which covered a further portion. A separate mill heritage grant administered by a nonprofit dedicated specifically to operational mill preservation, which Grant Fenner had mentioned in passing and which Dorothy had looked up on her own after their meeting. The numbers Ruth Collard walked her through did not make the restoration free. Nothing was free, and she was not in the business of making things sound simpler than they were. But they reduced Dorothy's out-of-pocket exposure from an amount that would require selling the Sutter Falls house and the settlement money combined to an amount that the settlement money alone could cover with a meaningful buffer remaining. The difference between those two things, Dorothy thought, was the difference between a decision made from desperation and a decision made from choice. She thought about what her attorney Geraldine Moss had said during the divorce proceedings. Courts work with what can be assigned a number, and much of what Evelyn had contributed resisted that. She corrected herself. Much of what Dorothy had contributed had resisted that. She had been thinking about the stories she'd heard from other women in the same position, women whose work had not appeared on paper the way a salary did, whose contributions had been invisible in the accounting. But the accounting here was different. Ruth Collard's spreadsheet gave every element a number. The timber, the water rights, the restoration value, the grant eligibility, the historic designation, the conservation asset classification, the senior water right registered in 1882. Every piece of what Vera had assembled over 40 years had a number, and the numbers were not small, and they did not resist being added together. Dorothy looked at the total at the bottom of Ruth Collard's spreadsheet. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she asked Ruth Collard to walk her through the National Register application process. She filed the National Register application in January with Ruth Collard managing the paperwork and James Okafor reviewing the legal elements. The process required a documented history of the property, a physical description of the structure and its contents, a statement of significance, and a set of photographs meeting the National Register's specific technical requirements. Ruth Collard had done this 47 times. She moved through it with a methodical speed that did not sacrifice accuracy. Grant Finner submitted the Historical Society's documentation package in support of the application. Paul Steger provided a preliminary restoration plan that served as the technical foundation for the grant applications that would follow the listing. Thomas Weld provided the timber appraisal in the form required for the conservation asset documentation. Dorothy managed all of it the way she had learned to manage renovation projects in the house on Mercer Lane. She tracked every deadline, every submission, every responding party. She maintained a file that was organized the way her mother's files had been organized, logically and completely, with nothing left to inference. She wrote every follow-up letter within 24 hours of any communication that required one. James Okafor said to her, at their February meeting, that she was the most organized client he had worked with since Vera. Dorothy said she had learned from the same teacher. She drove to the crane mill twice a week throughout the winter. She had arranged with a local handyman to address the most urgent roof issues on the North Addition, a temporary repair to stop the water damage from advancing while the formal restoration planning was finalized. The work was not the restoration. It was maintenance. She was clear about the distinction because Paul Steger had told her in their first meeting that well-intentioned amateur repairs could damage historic fabric in ways that complicated professional restoration, and she had no intention of becoming a cautionary tale. What she did at the mill during those winter visits was learn it. She walked every part of it, in different lights, in different weather. She learned which floor sections were firm and which needed to be avoided. She learned the sound the building made in a northwest wind, and what that sound meant in terms of where the air was coming in and where the gaps in the envelope were. She learned the behavior of the mill race channel in wet weather, the way water from the hillside still tracked toward the old stone course after a rain, the memory of hydraulics that survived the absence of the wheel. She brought the ledger on one of those visits. She sat on the stone floor of the ground floor with the ledger open on her lap and read the entries aloud in the empty mill. Not performing anything. Not for anyone. Just reading the record of the work that had happened in this space to the space where it had happened. The names in the entries were the names of farms that had become other things or ceased entirely. The quantities were the measures of harvest that had fed communities that had changed and thinned over 60 years. The fees were the economics of a time and place that was gone. But the entries themselves were present in the way that careful records are always present. They described what had been real with the specificity that keeps real things from becoming merely historical. She sat in the cold mill with the ledger and listened to the creak outside and felt her mother's presence not as grief, but as company. In March, the preliminary response from the National Register came. Ruth Collard called her on a Tuesday morning to relay it, and the relay took the form of reading her the key sentence aloud. The Crane Mill, Clarion County, Pennsylvania, has been determined eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, subject to final review. Dorothy was standing in the kitchen of the house on Birch Street when the call came in. She looked out through the window at the garden, where the lilac was beginning to show the first swelling of buds at the tips of its branches. She said thank you to Ruth Collard, and they discussed the next steps in practical terms, and she kept her voice steady throughout the call, and when it ended she stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything. She thought about her mother writing letters to the Clarion County Historical Society from this same house, at this same table probably, watching the same lilac in the backyard. Patiently, over years, building the documentation that would eventually support exactly this determination. Eligible. Subject to final review. The final review was a formality, Ruth Collard had told her. Once the preliminary determination was made, the listing followed barring extraordinary circumstances, and there were no extraordinary circumstances here. There was only a stone mill in the Pennsylvania hills with its original machinery intact, standing on 7 acres with a senior water right and 60 years of mature hardwood timber, waiting for someone to come and see it for what it actually was. Vera had seen it. She had spent 40 years making sure that when the moment came, it would be seen clearly. Dorothy set the phone down on the kitchen table. She sat down. She looked at the metal box on the shelf above the stove, where she had moved it from the attic, where she could see it every morning. She thought about the Columbus apartment, the parking garage, the neighbors she never met, the gray flat feeling of days that went by without accumulating into anything. She thought about Raymond saying, "I haven't been happy for a long time." The way he had looked at the surface of the table rather than at her face. She thought about 39 years organized around someone else's life, and the specific quality of reaching the end of that and having nothing left in your own name. Except that was not quite true. Had not been true from the moment she unlocked the attic door. She had the crane mill. She had the 7 acres. She had the senior water right registered in 1882 and the 60 years of undisturbed hardwood and the millstones her mother's family had imported from France in the 1880s because they intended the best and were willing to pay for it. She had the network of people her mother had assembled. James Okafor and Paul Steger and Ruth Collard and Grant Fenner and Thomas Weld. Each of them working toward the same outcome from their different positions. Each of them having agreed before Dorothy arrived to be part of what Vera had started. She had the ledger. She had the letter on 8 pages, written in her mother's careful hand, dated 3 months before Vera died. She had the brass key. The lilac outside the kitchen window was coming back. Dorothy looked at it and thought about what her mother had written near the end of the letter, in the section where the handwriting changed slightly, became more like speech than document. "I know this is a great deal to find all at once. I know it will take time to understand. What I want you to know, before you begin, is that I did not leave you this because I thought you needed rescuing. I left you this because I always knew you were the person who would do something worth doing with it. I watched you for 63 years. I know what you are. I am sorry I did not say it plainly enough while I was there to say it." Dorothy folded the letter and put it back in the metal box. Then she picked up her phone and called Paul Steger to confirm the start date for the restoration assessment. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting for this call too. "Good," he said when she gave the date. He said it the way he said most things, without surplus, meaning it completely. The complications arrived in April, which was when Dorothy had begun to trust the shape of things, and which was perhaps the reason complications arrived then. Raymond called on a Thursday afternoon. She was at the mill, sitting on the loading area with her notebook and a thermos of coffee, going through the timber appraisal with Thomas Weld's annotations. She looked at the phone when it rang and felt her pulse lift slightly and then settle. She answered. He said her name. He had the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed the opening of a conversation. She said hello. There was a pause in which she could feel him assembling whatever he had planned to say. "I heard you've been spending time in Pennsylvania," he said. "Clarion County." She did not ask how he had heard. He had connections to enough people in enough places that information moved toward him without effort. "I have," she said. "A property up there?" His voice was calibrated to sound casually interested, which meant he had thought about how to sound. "A property? Yes," she said. She waited. There was a particular quality to Raymond's silences that she had learned to read over 39 years. This was the silence of a man calculating what he could reasonably ask for without appearing to ask. "I've been thinking," he said, "about things I should have said differently, about whether there were aspects of the settlement that weren't entirely fair." She looked at the crane mill, at the limestone walls in the April light, which was warmer than November had been and showed the stone at its best, the color shifting from gray toward gold at this hour. She thought about what her attorney Geraldine had said during the proceedings. She had said it more than once. Equitable distribution in Pennsylvania is not the same as equal. She had been saying that what Dorothy had contributed could not be fully recovered in a settlement. She had been right, and she had done what she could within the constraints of what the law could see. Raymond was now, Dorothy understood, calling because someone had told him something about the crane mill. She did not know what they had told him or how much. She knew the pattern. She had watched it operate across 39 years. When Raymond perceived an opportunity, he moved toward it with the warmth and reasonableness of a man who had always been on your side and was simply trying to help. She said, "Raymond, what is it you want to say?" Another pause. "I want to stay connected," he said. "I think we had more between us than the process acknowledged. I think it ended in a way that left things incomplete." She looked at the notebook in her lap. The timber numbers. The grant timeline. Paul Steger's restoration phasing plan. The National Register determination sitting in the file in her car. She thought about Vera receiving Edward Holt into the mill, trusting him with the business because she had needed capital, and he had offered warmth and reasonableness in a manner that read as substance before you understood it was technique. She thought about the last entry in the ledger. August 1961. A routine transaction. The day before something that was not routine at all. Raymond, she said, the settlement is final. What we had between us is accounted for in those documents. I'm not interested in reopening it. A beat. The warmth in his voice adjusted. Not gone, but modified. I hear you, he said. I just want you to know I'm here. If you need anything. If there's something I could do. There isn't, she said. I appreciate the call. She ended it. She sat on the loading area for a while afterward, not thinking about Raymond specifically, but about the category of thing he represented. The person who arrives when they perceive value. Who expresses interest in reconnection at the moment the reconnection might be useful to them. Who uses warmth as a navigational tool. She had spent 39 years inside that warmth without seeing what it was steering toward. She picked up her notebook and went back to the timber appraisal. The other complication came from an unexpected direction. A man named Dennis Hatch contacted James Okafor's office in April. He represented himself as a regional land developer with clients interested in rural Pennsylvania properties. He was polite and specific in his communication, which Okafor described to Dorothy as a sign that he had done his research, because people who have done their research are specific. He said his clients had identified the Millrace property as a candidate for a recreational development project. Private fishing retreat, limited number of cabins, exclusive membership model. He noted the creek access and the timber and the historic structure, which he described as a feature that could be tastefully incorporated into the resort aesthetic. He asked if the owner would be open to a conversation about purchase. Okafor read this to Dorothy over the phone with the neutral tone he used when delivering information he was allowing her to respond to before he offered an opinion. She asked him what it meant. It means someone has become aware of the property's characteristics and believes the owner may not be fully aware of its value, Okafor said. The language about the historic structure being tastefully incorporated is the tell. It means they intend to use it as a design element rather than preserve it. Dorothy thought about the millstones. The French burr stone imported from La Ferté-Sous-Jouarre in 1882. The Governor housing. The drive shaft her mother's father had maintained for 20 years, and Vera had maintained for 2 more. The last record in the ledger. What does tastefully incorporated mean in practice? She asked. Usually it means the exterior walls are preserved as a facade, and the interior is gutted for a bar or a reception space, Okafor said. She was quiet for a moment. Tell them no, she said. I already drafted the response, he said. I wanted your instruction before I sent it. Send it, she said. She thought about Vera's instruction to James Okafor, written into the trust terms. Do not sell the property for 1 year from the date of transfer. Go to it first. Her mother had known that the first year would bring offers. Had known that someone would look at 7 acres with a creek and mature timber and a historic structure and see a resort property. Had built in the year as a buffer, a period in which Dorothy would have to go to the mill and understand what it was before she could be tempted to let it become something else. The year was not yet finished, but Dorothy had gone. She had understood. She did not need the year's protection anymore, because she already knew what the answer was. The Crane Mill was not a resort. It was not a facade. It was not an incorporated aesthetic. It was a working mill built in 1882 by her family with French burr millstones and a senior water right, and 60 years of undisturbed hardwood on its eastern edge, and it was going to be restored, properly, by the only specialist in Pennsylvania who knew how to do it, and it was going to stand for another 140 years on the same foundation it had always stood on. Dennis Hatch's clients received their response from Okafor's office the following day. She was not party to the exact language and did not need to be. Okafor knew what he was doing. He had been doing it for Vera for 2 years, and he knew the shape of what Dorothy intended. The spring moved in the way Pennsylvania springs move in the hill country, gradually and then all at once. The creek rose and fell with the April rains. The hardwoods on the east ridge leafed out in stages, the red maples first, then the oaks, then the black cherry coming last and most fully, the canopy filling in over the weeks with a completeness that made the timber stand look, by May, like a wall of green pressing up against the sky. Dorothy was at the mill when the canopy filled in. She was there on a Wednesday morning in mid-May when the last of the oaks put out their leaves, and she stood on the bank above the mill race and watched it happen and felt something she did not try to name precisely, because naming it would have required her to reduce it. She thought about the specific feeling of standing in the Columbus apartment looking at a future that narrowed by the year. She thought about the quality of that narrowing, the way it had felt inevitable from the inside, the way it had seemed to be something that was happening to her rather than something she was choosing. This did not feel like something happening to her. She had gone through her mother's attic. She had opened a locked door. She had read a letter and driven to Clarion County and walked into a mill and stood at a table in a Victorian office and asked the right questions and made the right calls and worked through a winter of preparation with the same competence that 39 years of uncredited work had produced in her, applied now entirely to something of her own. She had done this. The creek ran below the bank with the high, clear sound of spring melt, fast and cold, carrying the winter's last stored water down from the ridge. The millrace channel, still silted but present, tracked the same sound at a lower register, the stone walls of the old channel holding the echo of the water that would eventually run through them again. Paul Steger's crew was scheduled to begin in June. The National Register listing was expected to be finalized within 60 days of the preliminary determination, which put the official designation in May or early June. Grant Fenner had submitted the preservation easement application to the private foundation in Philadelphia in March and had received an acknowledgement that the property was being reviewed as a priority candidate. Ruth Collard was preparing the federal historic tax credit application, which required the restoration plan Paul Steger had provided in the National Register listing, and would be submitted within 30 days of the listing being finalized. Thomas Weld had connected Dorothy with a conservation land trust in western Pennsylvania that was specifically looking to protect mature hardwood creekbank properties in the hill country. They had expressed interest in a conservation easement on the timber stand, separate from the historic preservation easement on the mill, which would provide additional funding and guarantee permanent protection of the 60-year growth that had been quietly accumulating on the East Ridge since the mill stopped operating. Every thread her mother had left in that metal box had a person attached to it. Every person had led to another. The network had been patient for a long time, waiting for someone to arrive and begin pulling the threads. Dorothy had arrived. She had pulled the threads. She was not finished. The restoration had not started, the grants had not been finalized, the listing had not been made official. There was a year of significant work ahead, possibly more, and the work would be demanding in the specific way of things that matter enough to do properly. But she was standing on her own ground in May, watching the hardwoods come into leaf on the ridge her great-grandparents had looked at from the mill 140 years ago, and the feeling she was carrying was not the gray narrowing she had been living inside for 3 years. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, which is the rarest and most earned of feelings, and which you do not question when it arrives. She took out her notebook. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top and beneath it, in the careful print she had been using since she found her mother's letter, and understood that careful records were an act of love as much as a practical function. She wrote down what she could see. The creek, the mill race, the stone walls in the May light, the canopy on the ridge, fully out now, dark green and dense. The mill standing where it had always stood. Her name on the deed. She called Clara that evening, sitting on the loading area as the light went long and gold across the south face of the stone wall. She had not planned to call. She had been sitting in the quiet of the May evening and had found herself reaching for the phone the way you reach for the person whose voice you want in a moment that deserves to be shared. Clara answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring, and Dorothy had never quite registered that before. She described what she was looking at. The creek, the canopy on the ridge, the millstones inside, which she had taken to visiting at the start of each trip the way you check on something important, just to confirm it is still there and still itself. She described Paul Steger's crew starting in June and the National Register listing coming through and the easement application that Grant Fenner had called a priority candidate. Clara was quiet through all of it. Then she said, "Mom, you're going to live there, aren't you?" Dorothy looked at the mill. She thought about the house on Birch Street, her mother's kitchen, the lilac at the side gate. She thought about the Columbus apartment she had given notice on. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." "Good," Clara said. "It's where you're supposed to be." Dorothy thought about what supposed to be meant. whether places could hold something for people across time and distance and decades of lost years. She thought about her mother driving the 200 miles to Clarion County 4 times over 2 years. She thought about the phrase Okafor had used, "the most prepared client I have ever worked with." She thought about Vera at 28, writing the last entry in the ledger, a routine transaction on an August day, locking the mill and walking away from it, waiting, watching, working toward it anyway for 40 years, and then leaving the key in the only place that made sense. Dorothy, the door at the back of the attic. Go through it. She had gone through it. She stayed until the light left the valley. Then she locked the mill door, walked across the low bridge, and drove back toward the house on Birch Street through the Pennsylvania evening with the notebook on the seat beside her and the window down and the May air coming through, green and cold, carrying the smell of the creek and the timber and the turned earth of a spring that was further along than anyone had quite expected. She was 63 years old. She had work to do. Real work. Hers. Paul Steger's crew arrived on the second Monday of June. There were 4 of them plus Steger himself. Dorothy had expected something louder, more disruptive, the way renovation crews usually arrived with the noise and disorder that comes from people asserting themselves on a space. These 4 were different. They came in 2 trucks with equipment cases and moved through the mill with the particular quiet of people who had been told to treat what they were touching with respect and had decided to mean it. Steger walked the site with her first. He had been there in 2019 at his own initiative, and again for the assessment in March. But this was the first time he walked it with the intention of beginning rather than evaluating. There was a difference in how he moved through the space, a settling quality, the way a person moves when they have made a decision and are now simply executing it. He pointed out the sequence as they went. The north roof section first, the emergency that was actively allowing water to reach the interior. Then the mill race channel, which needed to be cleared of 60 years of sediment before the water system could be assessed. Then the wheel housing, where the rotted wheel itself would need to be fully removed before he could evaluate the housing structure and begin fabricating a replacement. Then the mechanical train, the sequence of gears and shafts and governors that connected the water wheel to the millstones, each element to be assessed in place before any restoration work began. The stones themselves, he said, needed no restoration. They needed cleaning and dressing. The French burr, he had told her before, was self-indicating when it came to the dressing pattern. The grooves cut into the face of the runner stone to direct the grain outward during grinding were still legible. They had not been dressed since the mill last operated, which meant 60 years of dormancy had preserved the original cut pattern. His man, a specialist who had worked with him for 12 years and did nothing but millstone dressing and nothing else, would read the existing pattern and follow it exactly. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Dorothy spent the first day at the mill watching and staying out of the way. She had learned this from the renovations on Mercer Lane. The first day of any serious project was the day the crew was establishing its own sense of the space, its own internal logistics, the unspoken hierarchy of who did what and in what order. Interrupting that process with questions served no one. She sat on the loading area with her notebook and recorded what she observed. The north roof crew worked from scaffolding they had brought on the second truck. The mill race team worked with hand tools and wheelbarrows, clearing sediment with a methodical patience that told her Steger had briefed them about the stone channel walls, that nothing was to be disturbed that did not need to be disturbed. 2 others worked inside with Steger, inventorying the mechanical train, photographing every element before they touched anything. At the end of the day, Steger came and sat beside her on the loading area. He did this without announcement, just came and sat, which she had understood by now was his way of communicating that what followed was worth attention. "The wheel housing is better than I expected," he said. "The timber sill plates that support the housing have surface damage from water infiltration, but the structural wood beneath is sound. We won't have to rebuild from the foundation. We're restoring from existing material." He paused. "The governor," he said, "is original and complete. I want you to understand what that means." She looked at him. "The centrifugal governor that regulated the gap between the millstones," he said, "was a precision instrument for its time. The crane mill's governor is the original unit, installed when the mill was built, complete with all its working components. There are perhaps a dozen complete governors of this type still attached to functioning mill equipment in the country. Most were removed for scrap or simply lost when mills stopped operating. He said it without theater, the way he said everything. Just as fact. Dorothy thought about her mother. About Vera's father building this mill in 1882 with French burst stones and a governor that was a precision instrument for its time. About the intention in those choices. The intention of someone who knew what good meant and was willing to pay for it. She wrote governor, original and complete in her notebook and drew a circle around it. The National Register listing came through on a Thursday in late June. Ruth Collard called her at 8 in the morning with the precision of someone who had been watching the inbox. The Crane Mill, Clarion County, Pennsylvania, is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Dorothy was sitting at her mother's kitchen table in Sutter Falls with her first coffee. She looked out at the garden, where the lilac had finished blooming and was now dense green, occupying its corner of the property with the settled authority of something that has been there long enough to stop asking permission. She thanked Ruth Collard. She asked about the next steps. The federal historic tax credit application was ready to submit, Ruth said. The state preservation grant application, which Grant Finner's office had co-drafted, was ready as well. Both could be filed that week. They filed both applications within 4 days of the listing. The formal response from the private foundation in Philadelphia about the preservation easement came the following week. Grant Finner delivered it in person, driving out from the county seat to hand her the letter rather than emailing it, which was the kind of gesture that told her something about how he regarded what she was doing. The foundation letter was 4 pages. She read all of it before she let herself read the key sentence, which was in the second paragraph of the second page. The foundation is pleased to confirm its commitment to the Crane Mill preservation easement in the amount of $112,000 to be applied toward documented restoration costs in accordance with the terms outlined herein. Dorothy read the number twice. Grant Finner was watching her from across the table. That's the highest easement award the foundation has issued in the past 4 years, he said. I looked it up. She thought about Ruth Collard's spreadsheet. The columns of numbers she had walked Dorothy through in March, the restoration cost laid against the grants and credits and easement funding. She had run the numbers herself afterward, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, checking them the way she checked everything. The out-of-pocket cost to Dorothy, after the foundation easement and the state grant and the federal tax credit, was a number she could cover with the settlement money and have what her attorney would have called a meaningful buffer remaining. Meaningful buffer. She thought about what it meant to have a meaningful buffer. For the past 3 years, she had been living with the opposite of a meaningful buffer. She had been living with the specific arithmetic of a person who does not know how long what they have will last, who makes every small decision under the shadow of a larger uncertainty. She was 63 years old. The mill was going to take another year to restore fully. After that, the Conservation Land Trust easement would provide an annual payment for the timber stand. The preservation easement terms allowed limited educational and public access events, which Ruth Collard had said several mill heritage organizations would pay for the privilege of hosting. The water right, registered in 1882, was an asset that a water attorney in Pittsburgh had already described in a preliminary conversation as having value in the current regulatory environment that had not existed when the mill last operated. None of it was a fortune. She was not going to say it was. But it was ground. Her mother's ground, which was now hers, which was solid and real and increasing in its clarity the more she understood it. The summer moved the way summers move in the Pennsylvania hills. Hot in the valley, cooler on the ridge, the creek running lower by August as it always did, cleared down to the gravel over the shallower crossings. Paul Steger's crew worked through it. She drove to the mill 3 times a week and recorded what changed. The north roof was finished by mid-July, the new slates matching the originals closely enough that only Steger could have told you which were new. The mill race channel was cleared by the end of July, the stone walls cleaned, the original coursework intact for its full length from the diversion point on the creek to the wheel housing. The wheel itself was a separate project. Steger had arranged for a millwright in Vermont, a man who built operational wooden water wheels for the handful of working mill restorations happening at any given time, to fabricate a replacement wheel to the original specifications. The diameter, the bucket count, the materials, all documented from photographs and from the original carpenter's marks still visible on the wheel housing timbers. The wheel would arrive in September. Dorothy was at the mill on the afternoon in August when Stager's stone dresser worked on the millstones. His name was Robert Farr. He was 54 years old and had been dressing millstones for 22 years, which was roughly how long it had taken him to learn to do it well enough to work with Paul Stager. He worked with hand picks, a billhook, and a thrift, tools that had not changed substantially since the stones were first cut. He worked in a pattern, moving from the eye of the stone outward along the furrows, reading the original cut with his fingers before he followed it with the tool, deepening the existing groove rather than creating a new one. Dorothy watched him work for 2 hours without speaking. He worked in silence, or near silence, the small sharp sound of the pick on stone, and occasionally a low sound he made when he found something that interested him in the pattern. At one point he called Stager over and showed him something in the furrow geometry, a detail she could not follow from where she stood, and Stager looked at it for a long moment and made a note. When Farr finished for the day and came outside to clean his tools, Dorothy asked him what he had seen in the stone that had interested him. He looked at her with the evaluating look of someone deciding whether to answer technically or simply. The dress pattern, he said, is a mill-specific pattern, not a standard regional cut. Someone modified the furrow geometry for this specific stone, this specific pair. The angle of the furrow entry, the draft, the depth progression. It's been adjusted for the French burr material and for the grind the miller wanted. You can read what they were trying to produce from how they cut the stone. He looked back at the millstones through the open door. Whoever dressed these the last time knew what they were doing, he said. I'm following their work. I'm not improving on it. She wrote that in her notebook that evening, sitting at the table in Sutter Falls. Whoever dressed these the last time knew what they were doing. She thought about her grandfather. She did not know his name. Vera had never spoken of him, which meant the knowledge had died with the generation that had been displaced from this mill. She knew him only from the ledger entries, from the handwriting that preceded Vera's own, from the mill he had built with French burr stones and a precision governor and a modified furrow pattern on the runner stone because he had known what he was trying to produce. She thought about what it meant to follow someone else's work, to read the decisions they had made in the traces those decisions left, to continue rather than replace. That was what she was doing. Not building something new, continuing something that had been interrupted. The wheel arrived from Vermont on a Saturday in September, on a flatbed with 2 men who had made the drive overnight and were ready to go home. It was large, 14 feet in diameter, the buckets formed from white oak, the arms from white oak as well, the whole thing assembled with the kind of joinery that held without hardware, because the wood and the geometry did the work. Paul Stager walked around it for 20 minutes on the flatbed before he let it be unloaded, checking joints and tolerances with the unhurried attention he brought to everything. Dorothy stood beside him while he checked it. He looked at her once during the inspection with an expression she had seen before, not quite a smile, but the quality of a person who is pleased with what they are looking at. It'll do, he said. She had learned, over the summer, that from Paul Stager it'll do meant he was satisfied. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wheel was hung in the second week of September, the restoration crew spending 3 days on the installation, fitting it to the axle hardware in the wheel housing with a care that was part engineering and part the specific patience that comes from understanding you are installing something meant to last another century. When it was in place and the housing closed around it, and the mill race channel had been connected at the diversion point, Stager let the water through for the first time. Dorothy was standing on the bank above the channel when he opened the sluice gate. She heard the water before she saw it move, the particular sound of water finding a new path, louder than the creek's sound and more purposeful. It came down the cleared channel with the directness of something that had been waiting for this moment for 60 years, reached the wheel housing, and the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first. 1 revolution, then 2, then settling into a rhythm that was not the speed of rushing but of working, the deliberate pace of a mechanism that was converting the creek's energy into rotation and meant to do it for a very long time. Dorothy stood on the bank and watched the wheel turn and said nothing. Stager was beside her. He watched the wheel for a long time. Then he said, "She runs straight. She runs straight." The technical assessment of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and knew what a well-hung wheel looked like. The stone mill on the Millrace Creek was running for the first time since August 1961. Dorothy did not try to compose herself into something appropriate to the moment. She stood on the bank and let herself feel what was there without editing it. Grief and recognition and the specific weight of 62 years between the last entry in the ledger and this moment on a September bank. Her mother at 28 locking the door. The 4 transfers of ownership. The $11,000 county tax sale. The land trust Vera had used to bring it back. The letter in the metal box on 8 pages. The drive to Clarion County. The locked door at the back of the attic that Vera had been oiling for years. The wheel turned in the current. She walked straight. She went inside. The mechanical train engaged when Stager connected the pit wheel to the wallower, the first gear mesh that carried the wheel's rotation up through the structure to the millstones. The sound changed when the gears engaged, became lower and more complex, the overlapping frequencies of a machine whose components were working together. Stager walked the train from wheel to stone, checking each connection, listening to each gear mesh, watching the governor begin to spin as the rotation speed reached operating threshold. He stood at the millstones and looked at the runner stone, now moving above the bedstone, the gap between them the precise dimension he had set. He went to the grain hopper and poured in a small amount of grain he had brought, hard winter wheat, the kind of grain the Crane mill had processed in its working years. The grain fell through the eye of the runner stone and entered the gap between the stones, and the mill produced flour for the first time in 62 years. Stager caught a handful of the flour on a piece of cloth he held below the discharge chute. He looked at it, pressed it between his fingers, held it to the light. He looked at Dorothy. Even grind, he said. Very fine. The French burr is doing what it's built to do. She took the cloth from him and looked at the flour herself. It was pale and fine, finer than anything she had bought in a grocery store, with a warmth to its color that was not quite white. It smelled of the grain and of the stone, a clean mineral quality underneath the grain scent. She thought about the farmers in the ledger, their names in her grandfather's careful capitals and then in Vera's compressed hand. The harvests they had brought to this mill over 23 years, the fees they had paid, the flour they had taken home. The community of work that had surrounded this building and depended on it and had not known it was about to end. She put a small amount of the flour on her finger and tasted it. It was sweet. Not the sweetness that comes from added sugar, but the sweetness of whole grain processed the way grain is meant to be processed, slowly, between stones that are matched to the material, in a mill built by people who understood what they were building. She set the cloth on the workbench and looked at her grandfather's mill running in its September light. The State Historic Preservation Grant was approved in October. It came as a formal letter from the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, countersigned by the State Historic Preservation Officer herself, which Ruth Collard told her was unusual. She had never received a countersigned approval in 20 years of grant work. She said it without ceremony, as a factual observation, but Dorothy heard what was beneath it. The grant amount was $68,000. Combined with the foundation easement and the federal tax credit, which Ruth Collard had been told verbally was approved and was awaiting formal processing, the restoration had been funded at the level her spreadsheet had projected. Dorothy called James Okafor the day the state grant letter arrived. She read him the amount. There was a pause on his end. Then he said, "Your mother would be very pleased." "Yes," she said. "She would." Another pause. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Your mother came to my office for the last time in October before she died. She was not well. She had driven herself, which I later understood was the last long drive she made. She sat down in the client chair, and we went through the final paperwork, and when we were finished, she sat for a moment before she stood up." He paused. She said, "I hope Dorothy finds it in time to use it." I said, "In time for what?" And she said, "In time to remember who she is." Dorothy stood in the kitchen of the house on Birch Street and looked at her mother's coffee maker and her mother's curtains and the lilac through the window, dropping its leaves now in October, returning to the bare state in which it would spend the winter before coming back. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." He said, "I thought you should know." She finished the call. She sat at the table for a long time. In time to remember who she is. She thought about who she was. Not who she had been inside Raymond's life, the competent, invisible woman who managed what he would not manage and kept what he would not keep. The self that had been there before that, the 24-year-old in Columbus who was good with numbers in the specific practical way and noticed imbalances before she could name them. The self that could read a contractor's bid and know where the numbers were honest. The self that could sit in a mill in February with a flashlight and see what was sound and what was failing and understand the difference between structural damage and deferred maintenance. The self that could receive a list of names from her dead mother's notebook and call each one and build something out of the network that had been left for her. That self had not disappeared inside 39 years of marriage. It had been there, functioning, applied entirely to someone else's life. She had not lost herself. She had been using herself in a way that did not accumulate anything in her own name. The Crane Mill on the National Register of Historic Places. The preservation easement. The conservation easement on the timber. The state grant. The water right registered in 1882, which a water attorney in Pittsburgh was now advising her on in the context of a leasing arrangement with the County Watershed Authority that would produce a modest annual payment for as long as the right was held. None of it had come from nothing. All of it had come from her mother's 40 years and her own 63 years, and the specific skills those years had produced, applied now to something that was entirely and without condition hers. She moved into the Crane Mill property in November. She had not planned to live in the mill itself. The mill was an operating structure and a historic building, and it would remain both those things. But the south end of the property, the flat loading area and the land beyond it toward the county lane, had room for a small structure that did not compete with the historic character of the mill. She had talked to Steger about this in September. He had a colleague, an architect in Pittsburgh who specialized in sensitive siting near historic structures. The architect had come out in October and spent a day walking the property with Dorothy, talking about placement and scale and materials. They had agreed on a structure that was modest in its footprint and its ambition. Stone from the same local quarry that had supplied the mill's original limestone. A metal roof. 3 rooms and a covered porch facing the creek. Small enough to heat with a wood stove, large enough to live in properly. The architect had said, about a week into the design process, that Dorothy knew exactly what she wanted and did not need much from him except the technical execution. He said it without complaint, as a statement of professional respect. She was in the small rented house in the county seat while the structure was being built, driving to the property every day, bringing the notebook, recording what changed. Clara came in November. She had offered to come earlier and Dorothy had said, "Wait until there is something to show you." There was now something to show her. Clara arrived on a Friday afternoon, having driven from Pittsburgh where she had flown from Portland. She got out of the rental car and stood on the county lane and looked at the mill, and then she looked at the frame of the new structure going up south of it, and then she looked at the creek and the timber on the ridge in its November bare, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom." Just that. Her voice had something in it that Dorothy recognized as the sound of a person understanding something they had heard described but not yet seen. They walked the property together in the November afternoon. Dorothy showed her the mill, now restored, the wheel turning in the current, the stones dressed, and the mechanical train running and the governor spinning at its operating speed. She showed her the mill race channel, clear of 60 years of sediment, the water moving through it the way it had moved through it when Vera's father was alive. She showed her the timber on the ridge, the 60-year hardwoods standing dense and permanent under the gray November sky. She showed her the millstones. Clara put her hand on the runner stone the way Dorothy had on her first visit. She felt the granite and looked at the furrow pattern and looked at her mother. "He was good," she said. "Whoever built this." "He was," Dorothy said. "And he knew what he was building it for." They sat on the loading area in the late afternoon with the mill running behind them, the low complex sound of water and gears and stone, and Clara asked the question Dorothy had been waiting for her to ask. "What does it mean?" She said. "For you. Not the grants or the listing. What does it mean for you?" Dorothy thought about how to answer that honestly rather than cleanly. "It means I stopped being defined by a loss," she said. "2 losses. Mine and your grandmother's. I came here thinking I was managing an inheritance. I found out I was finishing something." Clara looked at the creek. "Grandma knew you'd finish it," she said. "Yes." She left the right tools for the job. Clara turned and looked at her with an expression that Dorothy could not fully read, something between admiration and a grief that was also somehow gratitude. She said, "She left you, Mom. That's what she left you." Dorothy was quiet. "She left you," Clara said again. a version of herself that she never got to be fully. She was trying to give it to you. Dorothy looked at the mill, the wheel turning in the current, the limestone walls in the last of the November light, the governor spinning at the top of the mechanical train, doing its precise work of keeping the stones at the right gap for the right grind. She thought about Vera at 28 and Vera at 60 and Vera at the end, driving herself to James Okafor's office for the last time, because there was paperwork to finalize and she meant to finish what she had started. I hope Dorothy finds it in time to remember who she is. Yes, Dorothy said. I think that's right. They sat until the light left the valley. The year turned. The small stone house was finished in February, which was later than planned because the roofer had weather delays in January that could not be helped. But the delay had not bothered Dorothy. She had spent the winter in the county seat, driving to the mill 3 days a week, learning the running mill the way she had learned the dormant one the year before. The sound of it in different weather. The way the wheel responded to the creek's level, slower in the January low water, picking up pace when the February rains brought the creek up. The way the stones ran differently at different speeds, the governor compensating, the gap adjusting, the grind staying consistent. She had taken on a tenant. This was not something she had planned, but which had arrived logically from the circumstances. Paul Steger's colleague, a young woman named Erin Marsh who was completing a graduate thesis on operational mill preservation in the Northeast, had asked in December whether Dorothy would consider hosting a research residency. Erin would be on site regularly to document the mill's operation in its first year of restored function, the mechanical data, the grind quality at different water levels, the seasonal variation in the mill race flow. In exchange, she would manage the mill's operational hours and the small, but growing number of visitors who had begun arriving since the National Register listing had been publicized in the Regional Historic Preservation newsletter. Dorothy had said yes. Erin arrived in March and moved into the grain storage room on the second floor of the mill, which had been cleared and fitted with a bed and a small desk during the restoration at Steger's suggestion. He had said, from his first visit, that a working mill benefited from someone sleeping in it, from the presence that came from occupation. Dorothy had not understood that at the time, and understood it completely now. The visitors had begun arriving in small numbers in the fall, drawn by the National Register listing and by Grant Finner's modest publicity efforts through the Historical Society. They were mostly people who cared about this specific thing, mill enthusiasts and preservation advocates, and a few farmers who had heard about a working historic grist mill in Clarion County and driven out on a Saturday to see it running. Dorothy was there on most visiting days. She did not lead tours. She stood in the mill and answered questions and let people put their hands on the stones the way she had put her hand on the stones on her first morning there. She had learned to read what the mill did to people who walked into it. The sound of it, the low, complex sound of water and stone and the governor spinning, worked on people physically before they were conscious of it. Shoulders dropped. Voices went quieter. The particular social performance that most people maintained in public fell away. She thought about why. She thought about what the mill was doing to them and what it had done to her. It was a place where something had been made with full attention for a very long time. The attention was in the stones and the walls and the mechanical train and the governor and the water channel. You could feel it. Not mystically, not in a way that required belief in anything beyond physics. In the way you feel the attention in any made thing that was built by someone who understood what they were building and why. Her grandfather had built this. Her mother had recovered it. She had restored it. 3 generations of attention, accumulated in the limestone and the French burr and the governor that was original and complete, in the furrow pattern that Robert Farr had followed exactly because whoever had dressed the stones last time knew what they were doing. In April, a journalist from a Philadelphia magazine drove out for an interview. The piece was about women and inherited property and what gets passed down between generations in forms that don't look like wealth until you understand what you're looking at. The journalist was 38, thorough, and had the specific quality of someone who had done enough reading about Dorothy's situation before arriving that her questions were the right ones. Dorothy answered them at the table inside the mill, with the wheel running outside and the stones turning above them. She answered them the way she had learned to answer most things in the past year, specifically rather than impressionistically, with the actual numbers and the actual timeline and the actual names of the people involved, because her mother had taught her that careful records were the thing that held up under scrutiny and vague impressions did not. The journalist asked her about Raymond. She asked it carefully, as a journalist asks something they know might be refused. Dorothy thought about it for a moment. He took what the settlement gave him, she said. I don't have feelings about it that require managing anymore. He made decisions, and I made decisions, and what I have now came from mine. The journalist wrote that down. She asked about Vera, about what it had been like to find the letter and understand what her mother had been doing for 40 years without telling her. Dorothy looked at the mill around her. The stones. The mechanical train. The governor spinning at the top of its shaft, doing the precise work it had been doing since the restoration in its unhurried, necessary way. She was protecting me from a story she had not finished yet, Dorothy said. She didn't want to give it to me as a wound. She wanted to give it to me as something usable. She waited until she had made it usable. The journalist looked up from her notes. She left you the tools, not the grief, she said. Dorothy thought about that. Yes, she said. That's what she did. The piece ran in May. It was read widely enough that Dorothy's phone spent a week receiving messages from people she had never met. Women mostly. Some of them with their own versions of the story, the uncredited decades, the divorce that reduced them to numbers that did not add up to what the years were worth, the inheritance that arrived late, and in a form no one had recognized as wealth. She responded to every message. Not with advice and not with encouragement in the generic sense. With the specific acknowledgement that what the person had described was real and that real things deserved to be named clearly. That took 2 weeks of evenings. It was worth the time. Raymond called once more, in June. She did not answer. She was standing in the mill when the phone rang, watching Aaron document the governor behavior at high water flow, and she looked at the name on the screen and felt nothing that required attention. She let it ring. He did not call again. Clara came back in the summer with her partner, a landscape architect named Vivian who walked the property with a professional eye and said, after 2 hours, that the relationship between the mill and the creek and the timber on the ridge was one of the most coherent historic landscapes she had encountered in Pennsylvania. She said it with the specificity of someone offering a professional assessment rather than a compliment, and Dorothy received it in that spirit. Clara helped her plant the cutting garden along the south loading area that Dorothy had been planning since the previous fall. They spent a Saturday in July putting in the beds, Clara and Vivian with the soil knowledge that came from their work and Dorothy with the precision that came from her mother's garden on Birch Street, which she had been tending since she moved to Sutter Falls and which had taught her, as Vera's garden always had, that growing things were not patient in the passive sense, but actively persistent, reaching toward what they needed with a directed energy that looked like waiting to anyone who was not paying attention. On an evening in late summer, Dorothy sat on the porch of the small stone house and looked at the mill in the amber light. She thought about the Columbus apartment, the specific texture of those months, the days that did not accumulate into anything, the future that narrowed in a way that had seemed structural rather than chosen. She thought about the house on Mercer Lane that she had managed for 39 years and left in a cardboard box on a Tuesday in August. She thought about Raymond sitting across the kitchen table with a calmness she now understood as the calmness of a man who had made his decision already and was simply delivering the outcome of it. She did not think about these things with anger. Not anymore. Anger had been present in the early months, legitimate and proportionate, and she had let it be there without performing it for anyone, and without letting it become the story she told herself about who she was. It had run its course in the way that honest emotions run their course when you do not suppress them and do not amplify them. What remained when the anger was finished was something quieter and more durable. She was 64 now. The mill was running. Her name was on the National Register. Not her name exactly, but the name of the thing she had restored, which was the same as the name of the thing her grandfather had built, which was the name her mother had been born to and had carried for 60 years under a different name without losing it. The Crane Mill. Hers. She thought about Vera's last drive to James Okafor's office. The paperwork. The final instructions. The woman who had driven herself 200 miles because she was not finished yet and intended not to be finished until the work was done. She thought about all the things Vera had not said in all the years she could have said them. She thought about the cost of that silence and the reason for it, and the way the reason was also a form of love, protecting Dorothy from a wound until the wound could be handed over as something useful instead. I hope Dorothy finds it in time to remember who she is. She had found it. She had found it on a November afternoon in the attic of her mother's house, behind a door that had been waiting for her with its hinges oiled. She had found it in the metal box, and the ledger and the brass key and the 8 pages of her mother's letter and the locked room that Vera had maintained for 30 years against the day her daughter would need to walk through it. She looked at the mill in the amber light, at the wheel turning in the current, at the limestone walls that had stood since 1882 and would stand for as long as someone was paying attention, and she felt herself completely present in a way she had not been present inside her own life for longer than she could account for. She was 64 years old. She had the Crane Mill. She had 7 acres and a clear creek and 60 years of hardwood timber and a senior water right registered before the century had turned. She had a daughter who drove from Portland to stand beside her in the mill and understand without being told that this was where her mother was supposed to be. She had James Okafor and Paul Stager and Ruth Collard and Grant Fenner, people her mother had trusted and left for her, people who had become her own through the work they had done together. She had the ledger. She had the letter on 8 pages in the metal box on the shelf inside, which she had moved from Sutter Falls to the stone house, which she looked at every morning with the same quality of attention she had given the mill when she first walked into it. She had the brass key on the ring. She kept it on the table beside the door. She had considered putting it somewhere organized, a drawer, a box, but she liked seeing it when she came in and when she went out. The weight and the simplicity of it. A brass key that had unlocked a door her mother had spent 40 years preparing her to walk through. The creek ran in the valley below. The wheel turned. She was finished with what she had been. She was exactly who she had always been. There was one thing she had not done yet that she had been thinking about since February. She brought the ledger to the mill on an evening in late August, after Aaron had gone to the county seat for supplies, and the property was quiet. She carried it the way she had carried it from the attic, carefully, with both hands, the leather cover warm from the drive. She set it on the workbench beside the bedstone. She opened it to the first page, her grandfather's handwriting in careful capitals, the date in the top corner, 1938. The first entry, grain received from a farm whose name she did not recognize, a quantity she could not picture clearly, a fee that was fair for its time. She read forward from there. Not quickly. She read every entry the way she had read her mother's letter. The way you read anything that matters, with the understanding that the words are doing more than conveying information. They are holding something. The shape of the days they were written in. The people present in them who have no other record. She read through the 1940s. The war years, which you could feel in the ledger without being told. The prices shifting. Some farm names stopping and starting again after a gap that did not need to be explained. Her grandfather's handwriting steady through all of it. The same careful capitals regardless of what the year was carrying. She read through the 1950s and into the last pages, the entries in Vera's compressed hand, the 28-year-old woman trying to run a mill while the ground was already shifting under her. You could feel that too if you knew to look for it. The entries were precise, more precise than her grandfather's, as though Vera was compensating for uncertainty with accuracy, making the record as clean as she could in the time she had. August 1961. The last entry. Dorothy sat with the ledger open to that page for a long time, in the running mill, with the wheel turning outside and the stones dressing slowly above the bedstone and the governor spinning at its operating speed. Then she closed the ledger. She put it on the shelf above the workbench, between the small, mounted photograph of the mill taken in 1938 that Grant Fenner had sourced from the Historical Society's archive, and the framed copy of the National Register listing certificate that Ruth Collard had sent in a mailing tube with a note that said simply, "Well done." The ledger belonged here. Not in a metal box in an attic in Ohio. Not in an archive or a museum, though its documentation had been fully photographed and was on record with the Historical Society. Here, in the place where it had been kept, in the building it recorded. She looked at it on the shelf for a moment. Then she went outside and stood on the bank above the mill race and watched the wheel turn in the last light of the August evening and let the sound of it be the sound of something that had come back. That was enough. On most evenings, sitting on the porch with the mill running in the amber light and the hardwoods on the ridge going dark against the sky, it was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.